Was about building rubrics and success criteria. You know, what kind of things go on in our head when we make those choices. Um, I've said this before as well, and I'm going to say it again. I have a love-hate relationship with traditional rubrics. The whole 4-3-2-1 rubric, where a lot of times the same way that assessments are not very inclusive, some of these like rubric makers that you could find online are very generic. And unless you're going to doctor them really well and really specifically, if you're almost starting from scratch again, except for the boxes. You should never have creativity in a rubric. You should never have anything that is related to non-standard based, accessible, really, skills. We should not be judging kids' creativity in writing or in all of these things. And if you're doing a project in a science, social studies, math class, how creative a kid is should not be something that counts against a student or for a student, really. It goes back again into like some of those compliance measures too, like lateness counting against kids, or points being added for extra credit because they get it in early or they do something extra. If there's something worth doing in the project, don't make it an extra, make it a part of the project. You know, I think that when we think about mastery in particular, and we're talking about going deeper, kids shouldn't get extra credit for exhibiting mastery. I think that that's definitely something that we need to be mindful of. So that having been said, when I first read about Jen Gonzalez, she had started talking about the single point rubric, and this has come up in these chats again earlier as well. The single point rubric was like the best way for me to sort of get comfortable with a rubric. And basically what it is you put the criteria in the middle, and that's what proficient is. That's the standard. You have something on the left where if students are not quite reaching that standard yet, you have space to give specific feedback as to why. And on the right side, if kids are exceeding it or doing it better than what the standard is speaking to, there's space for that as well. And basically what happens then is kids could self-assess using that same rubric where they're filling in the boxes of what they think about themselves before you see it. And it's a really great precursor to teaching them to do really good reflection, because they're starting to think about specific things they did in their work and how they are able to show it in their work, because they have to make references to the work that they're doing. I think far better than rubrics is co-constructed success criteria. And that's when you have your learning targets, objectives, aims, goals, whatever you're calling them, and you have what you want students to get out of the learning experience you're creating. And on the front end, once you introduce to kids what they'll be working on, asking them what it's going to take for them to be successful. What does it look like? You could look at an exemplar and, you know, maybe give them a couple of exemplars, have them select the one they think is best, and then start talking about why they think that is the exemplar that is the best. And then together, you say, all right, well, what makes this good? And you list it together. And then you put that in the list of success criteria, because now they've seen what it looks like. They've determined the important things that make something look good. And since you've selected the exemplars that they're looking at, and you know the specific skills you need them to get, while you're co-constructing, and it is a co-constructing exercise, you could certainly pose clarifying questions that make sure that all the pieces you need to have in that rubric or success criteria are in there, but in language they say themselves. So I'm not saying you go rogue, you let them do everything themselves. I think that some kids will be able to do that, but as a class exercise, it's really important for kids to know what success looks like before they start. And I also know that if we give rubrics back just as a means for assessing at the end, where we're circling boxes about where they are, that's not necessarily as helpful as we might think it is. I have always found that having the 1 and 2 criteria on a rubric is making some really, it's coming from deficit thinking almost. Why should I tell a kid they're going to get a 1 or a 0 if nothing is present? How about we just give them the proficient one, the proficient criteria, and we have them shoot for proficient or masterful instead of showing them what it's going to look like if they don't get there. They're going to know if they don't get there. And I don't think that the rubric needs to have all of the lessened criteria. They could all work back in their brain what it's going to look like if they don't do the things they're supposed to do. And then again, it comes down to compliance. Once it becomes like only met 3 parts of this criteria, and that's why you're not getting this. What if those 3 parts really do exhibit mastery? Like, why do I need to do all 5 in order to show that particular thing? So we have to just be careful about the language that we use when we're assessing kids in general.
And Brian had a really good question that I know comes up a lot about when we co-construct, do kids, kind of like play the system, set the bar low. And I was just wrote in the comments, I don't see that, but I don't work in high school for one. But I will say it's a very common worry. And on my side too, what I've seen is the opposite. Is when we're creating the criteria and we're digging into the examples, even like as low as kindergarten, they start expecting, themselves and their peers to write like Patricia Polacco or whoever they happen to be studying that day. And that then when they look at their own samples and their peer samples, when they're building out a progression, maybe to bring those criteria to life, that they can be, I don't want to say like too hard, but almost they like over demand on the quality side, because we want that quality, but we're not always looking for the perfect. We're saying, let's build a progression. But then I wonder, and he asked specifically about AP classes. And I know you've had a lot of experience there, and I've had none.
I'm going to say it was Matt who said that.
Brian, I think.
Brian. So Brian, I'm going to go with Isaac as well. I have noticed that I would say 98% of my students lowball themselves against high criteria. The expectation is always high, and they don't see themselves as good as they are. I think that, some of these kids, they set expectations and then they're like, well, I can't possibly be at mastery level yet, even though they come to class with certain skill sets that I think other educators may have told them weren't good enough. And that's kind of where we have to stop doing this. Non-AP as well, I think, you're going to have a small percentage of kids who have like delusions of grandeur, who are going to tell you they are higher than they are. But for the most part, I think they know. And if you call them on it and ask them to sort of show them where, and when you're co-constructing that success criteria, if it is a low ball, that becomes a really great teaching moment, a good conversation to have with the class. On a 12th grade level, if we look at the standard of what graduation requirements are, you need to be able to do this. This is what the language is. And giving them the language and then even unpacking the standard with them so that they understand what's going on, then you could kind of parse out the semantics, having a conversation about, well, what does it mean when we say effective? And what does it mean when we say, proficient in this context? Because there is a lot of jargony and non-specific subjective words in state standards, especially if you're still
Mm-hmm.
using the Common Core standards, that unless there is a consensus about what those things look like and what they are, they don't mean anything. And they're wrought with them. So doing an unpacking exercise and building a progression with students, not just as teachers, particularly at the secondary level, starting as young as 6th grade, is a really worthwhile activity because it's going to teach them that academic language. It's going to teach them what the skills are. It opens up conversations for why are we doing this? How does this apply to my life and my world? Where does it connect in other contexts? It really does open up a forum to have those really deeper necessary conversations to get kids to buy into the learning that's happening. I also know high achievers really enjoy like multiple choice tests and things that are very concrete where they know that they could achieve just by, figuring stuff out. And when you ask them to do projects or you ask them to do things that require more synthesis, that are a little more flexible in the how, that freaks them out because they just want somebody to tell them what to do. And to me, that's not good learning. If you're still at a place, even in an honors class, where the teacher is the only one who could tell you how and what to do, then we're missing a huge opportunity to have those conversations and dig deeper into what learning really needs to look like. And I think it's important that we have those conversations. Who just said about math would be interesting to
That was Brian, yeah. And somebody else said that they agree that the kids overshoot, but I couldn't find who that was because I was going to let you know.
Yeah, I mean, I have one student in mind right now that's sort of in my head, and she was a brilliant writer. She's still a brilliant writer. I believe she is just graduating from Skidmore now. And like, she couldn't even take compliments on her very brilliant writing. And she was a brilliant writer. And I've never been the type to overpraise. That's not the kind of teacher I was. I always was very strategic in the praise that I gave to my students. I could be validating and I could also be supportive, but I am never the person who just told somebody that something was great unless I really was that impressed with what was going on. But at the end of the day, one might say, what does it matter what I think anyway? So I would say that to them as well. At the end of the day, when I'm giving feedback on a piece of writing, these are my suggestions. They are the writer. They are the author of the work, and they have to make the choices. My only thing is you have to be able to defend the choices that you make. Why did you make them? What was the intended impact? Do you think you did that? The same way we discuss it in authors when we're talking about the choices authors make and why you think you made, why we think they made them and what the impact of those choices are, whether it's semantics or vocabulary or character or setting or even the genre. That's definitely a conversation that comes up when I teach Animal Farm.
Excuse me.
Something that came up when I was teaching Animal Farm, and most people would be like, why do you teach Animal Farm in an AP class? That's like a 7th grade book. And the answer is yes, the content is definitely low, but what I can do with a book like Animal Farm, that's a complete allegory, is not have to worry about my students comprehending what they've read, and we can specifically talk about author's craft. So we don't talk about what happened in a chapter, we talk about Orwell's choices, the underlying allegory, the historical context, and starting straight off at the top, why would Orwell choose to write this very politically charged piece as a fable allegory? Why are there animals doing all of this? Who is his audience, and why did he choose that audience? And it's a bigger question that if I try to jump straight into satire with, looking at Gulliver or Swift's other work, for example, that's not as accessible. Kids can't read it. The same thing if I asked, if we looked at language and author's meaning immediately at Shakespeare, you know, or any author that isn't completely accessible. Even if I brought Beloved in by Toni Morrison and started talking about that, there's so much going on in that text as well that is not so obvious unless you're a good reader. And talking about narrator in that sense too, there's still a lot of time you kind of have to parse and actually make sure that they understood what they read. So you choose an easier text so that you could look at the craft and talk about choices. And I digress. So
that's so powerful. And I think it tied back to what you're saying up front is like, if we can't agree on what proficient is, then we can't put it on a rubric and we can't assess it. And so then if kids can't handle the content yet, they're not going to be able to take it to that next level.
right.
So it is from the standards, but then with understanding of our kids and back to the point of, will kids be off on their self-and-peer assessment? Yes. But I usually find it's not intentional. They're not lying about it. I mean, maybe, but usually not. But I will say they usually don't have clarity. And everything you've expounded upon is clarity. And I've found in my own work as a consultant, even today, I was like going through my examples, I think I was doing a good job. And then somebody asked a question. I was like, oh yeah, they could not have done this because they had no clarity on what was, they kind of knew the why, they knew some of the what, but I hadn't connected them well. So had they done one, we wouldn't have been on the same page at all. This is something I'm really familiar with. I have criteria for, but a great reminder that without that conversation, that back and forth, I wouldn't have known, hey, how do we know if we're doing a good job?
Well, I mean, I think it's important as educators, and I was just saying this to a group I was consulting with last week, like, I think a lot of times teachers don't explore their own clarity, and it took me a long time to realize that I wasn't as clear as I needed to be sometimes. And there was an impact to that. I mean, students were getting something, but it wasn't necessarily intentional. It wasn't what I had hoped they'd get. Right. So we have to be super clear and we have to be super intentional with everything that we do in the classroom. And one easy thing we can do is when we're designing projects, when we're designing assessments, do them. And see where you struggle. See if it actually forces you to use the skill that you're hoping kids will. Is the content broad enough that they're going to be able to show you what they know? And have you given enough opportunities for kids to show it in multiple ways? And is it, you know, what level of bloom are you working on? Is it just, you know, straight up comprehension and you're asking them to just regurgitate information, or are you actually asking them to transfer and synthesize information they've learned so that you know they've really internalized the learning in a more important way? Anyway, I know, Isaac, that was your...
Yeah, sorry, I did not know it was going to be that loud.
And I just want to
as I frantically tried to shut it off.
I just want to say thank you to everyone this week. I hope this was helpful. We'll be back again next week, and I'll post probably on Wednesday or Thursday to kind of get where you'd like us to work for next time. Lastly, I'll just give you a quick check-in on the book. Hopefully the draft will be done in another week and a half. Yeah. And let's just say I have learned a lot in this process. This has definitely been the hardest book to write that I've ever written. So feeling pretty humbled these days. Anyway, I hope everybody has an awesome Friday. Thank you so much, Isaac, for spending this time with me.
Thanks for letting me join. Yeah, I love this community. And as I think it was Brian said up top, being that lone wolf, it is so powerful to have this community where we can belong and be connected. And just when you feel like you're the crazy one, you're not crazy. We're thinking differently. How is this impacting students, and how is this impacting students' learning is a very different question than the response you give when you say, I don't do grades. I don't believe in grades. That sounds crazy, but there's good reasons.
It does sound a little crazy. Yeah. Okay, everyone, have a great Friday. We'll see you next week.